It's not a very hard clap.
Pretty bad clap, to be honest. I'd love to know why we clap. You know, like why human beings clap.
To like make your presence known.
But I mean, like when something is...
I think it might be like the loudest noise that's easy to manufacture.
But you could all just like scream. Like if someone does something you like at a show, you could just like scream at them.
People shout like bravo.
Yeah, well they do that, right? But,
yeah.
but has it always been clapping? I wonder. I have no idea.
But that would be unusual to like the conclusion of an opera, and then instead of this, everyone just goes.
Well, I don't know who.
It does happen at like a soccer game. I feel like a football match rather. That
yeah.
There's just like all these guys just. They're not clapping. You just let out a primal yell. So is it just like a civilized replacement for just yelling your head off?
But like trying to make a thunderous noise. I mean, I wonder.
The most effective way to make a lot of noise, show appreciation, strengthen social bond that comes from enjoying something together.
To the most effective way to make a loud noise together. Surely it's more effective to just scream.
I feel like it's the same.
You can clap for hours, you can't scream for hours.
That's true. You can clap for longer.
I feel like it might be the same way why you would clap to mark when you're filming something to synchronize everything, because it's the quickest way to manufacture a very sharp, distinct sound.
I guess that is louder, and it requires a lot more to make that level of noise with my mouth. Although we use this wonderful sort of AI enhancing tool, so we're having this conversation, and anybody listening is just not going to hear any of the claps. I'm just going to look like a fool.
So you're ethically fine with those AI tools?
Oh yeah. It feels a bit bad actually, because like it's quite clear that with how easily our like audio post production got taken over by AI, I do sometimes worry for poor Alex over there and his job. But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Christopher, Magnify on YouTube. I'm so glad to have you on the show. You've got about 1.5 million subscribers, and you've managed to do it just through using YouTube Shorts. Some of the most interesting and captivating YouTube Shorts on the platform. I imagine that most people watching this, even if they don't like know your name or know who you are, when they see your face and hear you talk, they'll recognize you because you're doing quite well for yourself. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
It's really exciting. Some of the stuff that you do that's really sort of piqued my interest has been your biblical analyses in terms of the language and history of the Bible. And we were just speaking a moment ago, and you told me that we could potentially do an entire episode just talking about the linguistic quirks of the very first phrase of the Bible. You open the Old Testament, Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's what I always read. What can you tell me about it?
Well, there's a little bit more to the English version of Genesis 1:1, because as you said, it's in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and then there's a period. There's a big fat punctuation mark, which is really quite interesting because as like an ancient language, ancient Hebrew doesn't have punctuation. So there's a big question about what is the significance of introducing a punctuation mark into a text in which one wasn't there. I think in ancient Hebrew, there is like little markings on a scroll to let you know when you've reached the end of a line. But that's not the same thing as a period. And a period definitely has a meaning of like this idea stops here and doesn't continue on to the next one. So there's a big question about whether or not there should be a period at the end of Genesis 1:1.
What difference would that make? Because what comes next, and the earth was without...
Shapeless and void, and the Spirit of God moved over the spirit of the waters.
Yeah.
Another period there. And God says, let there be light, and there was light. So in the English version, by the time you get to let there be light, there may be 3 or 4 periods or 3 or 4 stops. Are you familiar with the Bible translator Robert Alter?
No.
He's like probably the most highly regarded working translator. And he spent, very unusual for a Bible translator, that he spent about 20 years translating classical literature and then got sucked into this project of translating the Old Testament with all of that literary sensitivity to style and format that maybe someone who went to seminary isn't sensitive to. So when he talks about Genesis 1:1 and the punctuation, the literary effects of punctuation in Genesis 1:1, he talks about that it really slows down the pace, and that for an original reader, there's a sense in Genesis 1 that the universe is happening extremely fast, like an explosion almost, which is really interesting. And so when he translates it, he says the original reader would feel that this is all happening very quickly. Like in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was shapeless and void, and God said, let there be light, and there was light.
Right.
And Hebrew is also a much more like economical language, quicker language. So the first verse, I think, in Hebrew, Genesis 1:1, is 7 words in Hebrew, and it takes English 12 words to accomplish the same thing. So it's nearly double the speed, takes double the length of time to say it, and it's got these plotting period marks that remove that information that this is an event that's happening rapidly. And you could say that is meaningless information, that it doesn't change anything about it. But to me, that seems like a interesting way to communicate something about the creation of the universe, that it happened fast rather than in this calculated, slow way, more of like an explosion.
Yeah, well, the image that I have in my head of Genesis is the sort of old man in the sky sort of doing this and doing that and fiddling with this and turning this on and turning that on. I mean, I don't speak Hebrew at all. I can't read Hebrew, I mean to say, and I had no idea that there was so much variance just in like a single sentence like that. I know that a lot of these ancient languages don't have punctuation, but I do wonder how ancient readers did separate out their ideas. I mean, was it just sort of natural reading the text where one idea ended and another started? Or, as you say, there might have been indications of some kind of line break or something, but was it really just this continuous stream of text?
I think that's very likely. And you have to think about like the oral tradition of sharing this story before it was even written down. It's like, was the reader getting off to a calculated and calm and steady start? Or was this like kind of in media res explosion onto the scene? And those were two different experiences, first as a listener, and then when you're trying to translate that experience into a written scroll, it's a different reading experience to like have this measured. I feel like that might be the same with poetry. There's a difference if you're like reading Byron or something like that, and you're just like blazing through it versus like savoring each line and like getting hooked. So there's a big difference, I think. And Robert Alter, when he talks about the difference that these punctuation marks make, he says that like the style of the passage is more than just like an embellishment of a message, but it's like a vital medium through which ideas are communicated. So it's like not something that you can just take it or leave it. It's like, this is how the Bible might be communicating something about this event.
Yeah. I mean, I want to ask how that problem can potentially be avoided. If there would be a way in translation. I mean, presumably kind of not, given that everybody does include sort of normal English punctuation. But I wonder if there would be a way in translation to convey the same feeling of the sort of continual idea that still makes grammatical sense. I mean, you could maybe sort of try to use commas instead or something, or maybe write it as verse and have no full stops or punctuation, but like a line break, you know, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, line break, and the earth was without form, but like maybe not a capital letter on the and, something like that, you know?
Yes.
I don't know.
That comes up in music notation a lot because you've got like someone delivering, here's the notes you have to manufacture to recreate this melody. But like any musician knows, that's not really the message. The message is like in the crescendos and
Yeah.
You're more of a musician than I, so you probably know more of those terms.
Well, have you ever read the lyrics to a song that you've never heard before? It's oftentimes just an incredibly cringe-making experience. It's a bit of a sort of known fact, I think, among artists. I may be wrong about this, that you'd think that poets would be good at writing lyrics and good lyricists would be good at writing poetry, but they're actually not as translatable as you might think. If you try to take a poem and set it to music, it's actually incredibly difficult to do. I have a friend who worked with a very esteemed poet, and the idea was it was sort of a musician friend and the esteemed poet, and they were going to come together and create a song. And I think it kind of didn't work in the end because it turns out that good poets don't make good lyrics, and it's because if you read these lyrics, it's just like really weird. If you can't hear the tune and the phrasing, it's a bit sort of clunky or it sounds a bit bad. And I'm thinking here, maybe like reading the Bible in translation is a bit like reading the lyrics to a song without knowing what the music is, without knowing what the phrasing is supposed to be. And it just makes it sound a bit more clunky and almost like have a different message.
I think with the Quran, they definitely take that approach.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so every verse is going to have a set melody that maybe you can improvise or add little flourishes, but then I think they would believe that that musicality is just as sacred to the meaning of the text as the shape of the letters.
Yeah, well, that's why. I mean, I have found Qurans that are just written in English, but you almost always find Qurans with the English printed next to the Arabic because there's this sort of overt recognition that, okay, we're going to translate this into English, but you have to recognize that this is a compromise because the language of the recitation is Arabic, and there's something in the phrasing, in the pronunciation, in the way that it's so melodic that is part of not only part of the message itself, but also part of the very proof of its divinity. There's a sort of test in the Quran to produce something so well put together, so genius, so beautiful, so perfect, which is something that just can't be captured in a translation. And I think actually people just tend to forget this more when they're reading the Bible. They forget just how much a translation can completely alter our interpretation of the words. We're talking here about full stops. It seems maybe a little more trivial than some other examples. I mean, there are so many translation differences which are absolutely huge. I'm thinking of like Paul in the New Testament writing about women, and there's this verse in 1 Timothy that he suffers not a woman to teach nor to usurp authority over a man. Rather, she should remain silent. And that sounds really bad. I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over a man. But I've spoken to some scholars who think that the phrase for sort of teach and assert authority are actually kind of together. And Paul uses a word there which isn't the normal word for authority. He uses something else which tends to actually mean sort of seizing authority that isn't rightfully yours. And so this little translation might have the verse read more as like, that a woman should not seize authority she doesn't have to speak in church. And these scholars say that he was writing to this church in Ephesus where there was this cult of Artemis, where it was like a feminine cult, and they were sort of taking over the churches. And I don't know how much credence I give to this, but it at least opened my eyes to the fact that the translation of a single word there can completely alter the way that you interpret a text.
There's definitely one of those in Genesis 1:1 where it's not like, oh, this just changes the style, but like radically separates the story into two very different things.
Tell me about it.
It's the second word of the Bible. So the first one I think everyone agrees on. It's just means like at the start of something or in the beginning. It just takes one Hebrew word because again, it's more economical. So everyone's agreed that about the first word, but then there's a lot of disagreement about what is actually beginning, because the second word of the Bible is a verb, create. And since there's no tense in ancient Hebrew, there's a lot of the tense of a verb is like derived from context clues. So there's a lot of question over what is actually beginning at the beginning. And then there's a lot of question about whether created should be in the past tense, created, or an infinitive of to create and to create. So in the beginning of God's act of creating versus in the beginning God created. Does that make a difference between those two?
It could read something like, in the beginning of God's creation,
Yes.
This happened.
Yeah.
Or it could be in the beginning, God made a creation, something of that sort.
And I think the difference there is almost like if you look at a comic book strip, in one version, the first cell of the comic strip is just like a blank square because it's the beginning and there's nothing there yet. And then God creates the heavens and the earth and it all appears in the second strip, the second cell of the comic strip. In the second version, if it's in the beginning of God's creating, then in that first cell of the comic strip, there might be some primordial materials that are already there. And then God starts to decide to make something out of it. So it's the beginning of his creating. It's not saying like in the beginning. It's just like, well, when God started to start making some stuff. And if you look at the actual like text, it seems to be more in support of that second option, because the second verse talks about the earth being shapeless and void and the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. So if that verb is truly past tense and God created everything, how was there all this material before he created anything? So it doesn't seem like it's saying in the formal beginning of everything. It's just like,
I mean, typically the image we have is God creates the heaven and the earth. So he sort of pops into existence this thing called the earth, and then there is this earth which is without form and void, or formless, or whatever word you like to use. And I've never quite known exactly what that means for the earth to be without form and void.
That's kind of an encroachment of like Greek philosophy onto the text from what I've read, because the word that's actually used in the Hebrew is like a made-up word, like helter skelter. And then when I guess the Greek translators were trying to figure out how do we communicate this made-up word into our new culture, they kind of borrowed that classic Greek idea of form and formlessness. And so that's like more of a Greek encroachment of a more philosophical statement, where
that's fascinating.
The Hebrew uses like a more playful word for just kind of like the earth was helter-skelter, I guess, basically.
Yeah, but do we know what that word is trying to sort of get at?
It's just like a made-up word, like
Really?
it's like a sing-songy word.
Really? And we don't see that word used anywhere else?
I think it's used one other time in Bible, but as like an intentional reference to where it appears here.
Really? So I suppose we don't really know what it's supposed to be saying. So we've got like, in the beginning, God created, or potentially in the beginning of God's creation, the earth is something.
Yes.
And immediately the meaning of this text is falling apart to me, and makes me want to go and study Hebrew, to be honest, because I just can't get a grasp of what any of it means. It's really interesting what you say, by the way, about the Greek encroachment on the text. I did a podcast recently with Esoterica, Dr. Justin Sledge, and we were talking about the demiurge in like Gnostic philosophy. And for some reason we got on talking about the Trinity and how philosophies emerge. And he pointed out to me that the church fathers, in developing their sort of understanding of the nature of the infinite triune God, were using words like ousia, using like Greek concepts, because like Greek philosophy is popular and it just gets like imported as a product of its time into what these people believe is actually just like the eternal truth about the universe. But because that happens to be the framework through which they're understanding it, and you don't often recognize the framework that you have, right? And so you end up with this bias, or this philosophical frame that everything goes through without you even realizing. And it was interesting to hear that applied to the way that they sort of did their philosophy, but applied to a translation. That's really interesting, because you've got this meaning of this text, and depending on when it's translated into a different language, when it's translated into English, depending on what the translator is trying to get across, you can just totally change the meaning of what this text is supposed to be saying based on like essentially what philosophy is popular at the time.
Yes.
And it's kind of scary, actually. So I mean, how do you think we should read this text? Carefully is probably the correct answer there, but how do you approach it?
The way that Robert Alter translates it, who I really admire, is he translates that phrase as the world was welter and waste. So it's like, it's a little playful and a little bit more childlike, and it's like kind of sing-songy, because you can't manufacture a new word in the language, but he says it's welter and waste. So it's like a little poetic, kind of
welter
rhymey
and waste,
because formless and void sounds so like stately, and like the original is, I think, a little bit more playful and a more childlike. So to be true to that literary effect, but
you've spoken a lot about, or you've spoken before about the sort of the tone,
yes,
of the Bible. The like you say, without form and void sounds very formal and very serious. It's like a stern father telling you a story, right? But like, I think so much of essentially the undertones of Scripture can be lost in translation. I read a translation of the Book of Job, I really wish I could remember whose it was. I will find out. I've got it at home. I'll find out and I will put it on screen. Well, you will put it on screen. And he sort of tries to translate the Book of Job as a more poetic text. It's read more as a poem. It's more sort of beautiful. It's supposed to contain some of that. And reading the difference between God saying in the King James, like, gird up thy loins like a man, for I will question you and you will give me an answer. Still, it's pretty intense, but it's quite sort of like, and he translates it as something like, stand up like a man, I will question you, please instruct me. It's almost like sarcastic. It's like, go on then, Job, right? Please instruct me. I'm going to ask you some questions. Instruct me. It's a bit sort of sassy. And I have no idea if that's an accurate translation, but reading that made me realize that it seems like a way to translate what that text means, but it totally changes the attitude that I'm ascribing to God here. He goes from just being this angry, like, I'm going to ask you and you're going to answer, to a sort of like, okay then, all right, if you're so smart, here we go. It's almost a bit more sassy. Really, really interesting. And you're telling me that this can happen in Genesis 1:1 as well. There's something a bit more like maybe playful in the
playful and fast, and like a lot of the experience is very malleable depending on what assumption you have about what it's supposed to be sounding like.
And so is this how you would, if you were sort of reading the Old Testament to your children or something, would you pick this translation to?
I think that's good, and try to read like the first 3 verses in one breath, because maybe that's how it would be read out aloud in public.
Yeah, that's so interesting. You said that ancient Hebrew doesn't have tensed terms. So what you mean by that is like like there's no such concept as a past, future, or present version of any word at all.
You might say, like, in English, we would say, I walked to the store, to say I walked to the store yesterday. But like in an ancient language, you might say, yesterday I walked to the store. And there's the verb is the same verb as if you're talking about the future, present, or past. And then there's still, I feel like, a lot of languages that maybe Thai or something like that
well, sometimes
work similarly.
You often notice the quirks of different languages when you have a non-native speaker trying to speak English, right? Like you might hear somebody say something like, oh yes, yesterday I walked to the store. And you know what they mean, of course. And you're like, oh, it's not quite correct. And you think, well, maybe English isn't their first language, but that's probably a result of the fact that that's not a thing that they would do in their language. If I'm trying to say something in a language I don't really know very well, I might try to sort of piece together English words, and it ends up sounding very strange. I walk into a shop and I'm like, excuse me, I look for toilet nearby so I may relieve, thanks. Something like that, right? And it's like you get the message across, but something to do with the way that sentences are constructed. And I suppose a lot of that's probably going on in the Bible.
Yes.
And we have to sort of adapt it for English.
And I think it's especially powerful in the first verse of the Bible when it actually has a narrative difference about whether God is creating the universe from nothing or whether, in line with a more ancient cosmology, that he's organizing the universe from pre-existing materials, which I think to a modern reader, we're like, how could anything exist before God created it? That's not logical. But an ancient reader might be like, oh yeah, there always was stuff around.
Viewers of my show, hardcore viewers, will know that I'm what's called a mereological nihilist, which is this view that, well, mereology is the study of parts. And so mereological nihilism is nihilism about parts. So it's the view that there are no such things as real parts of objects. The best way of understanding what that means is to say that, like, objects like chairs and tables and things are just kind of arrangements of matter. Right? Like I've often sort of asked people, did this chair begin to exist? Like, was this chair here 100,000 years ago? No. But nothing has like popped into existence in the last 100,000 years, right? Like all that's happened is a bunch of pre-existing material has been sort of arranged in a particular way, and we call it a chair
for convenience.
Exactly. So I've taken some of this material and I arrange it into the shape of a cup, And I take some of this material and I shape it into a chair, and I say, oh, look, now there's a chair and now there's a cup. But really, the distinction between those objects and their very sort of existence is kind of conceptual. The distinction between them is a mental
totally.
one, not a real one. So mereological nihilism has this radical implication that objects kind of don't exist. I mean, when I say the chair, I'm sort of putting a mental construct over an arrangement of matter. And the matter that I'm referring to does exist in the real world. It's really there. But the concept of the chair, like its distinction between other objects, is not a real distinction, but a mental one.
A useful fiction, I guess.
Pretty much. And I say this as a sort of side note just to point out that, like, this view of the world that I've been advocating for a long time, that we basically just have one big lump of matter, and all we do is just arrange it in different ways and put labels on it. And that's where that's where everything comes from. I've always been really attracted to this kind of interpretation of Genesis, that this is what's going on, that God is a mereological nihilist. And he's sort of like, it's just a bunch of stuff, and he's essentially just arranging it. He's giving it form. He's just like imposing form upon the matter. It's almost quite Thomistic, sort of taking a bunch of matter and imposing form, and that's where you get objects from. I think that's really fascinating. I mean, my friend Dr. John Nelson likes to point out to me that the first task that Adam is given in Genesis is naming the animals. It's the task of naming, implying that you've already sort of got these creatures, and Adam's task, the first rational creature, is to, designate, like, labels. And it all sort of, when you look at this text as an attempted mythological account of sort of worldly origins, it starts to line up quite nicely with my mereological nihilist picture, that essentially everything we see in the world is just a bunch of matter that minds arrange and give form and then put labels on. And so suddenly this first verse of Genesis becomes a lot more beautiful to me, and a lot more sort of in keeping with my worldview.
If you choose to translate that in the past tense, it kind of eliminates the possibility of that whole meeting. It just...
Exactly. And that's...
Why do you think that view is attractive to you?
I was having a conversation with William Lane Craig years ago now. I must have been in like 2020 or something. And he's the man that made me realize I was a mereological nihilist, because we were debating an argument for the existence of God. And I made this point. I mean, the argument was that everything which begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe must have a cause. And I said, well, when have you ever seen something begin to exist, Dr. Craig? I mean, like, really, like, I mean, a car doesn't, like, begin to exist out of nothing. Instead, it's a rearrangement of pre-existing matter. And so if you're saying this is the kind of thing that God did, you're trying to make an argument that, God is the cause of the universe. If beginning to exist can just mean rearranging pre-existing matter, then I don't think that's the image of God that works for you, right? And he said, okay, I understand what you're saying, Alex, that you don't think that the car began to exist. It was just a rearrangement of matter. But I want your viewers to realize how radical a view you've just committed yourself to. Because you've just committed yourself to this view called mereological nihilism. Because if you think about it, like, I mean, do you understand what I'm saying when I say that, like, the car never began to exist? It was just a bunch of stuff that got rearranged and we called it a car, but nothing really began to exist. Well, if the car never began to exist, then the car doesn't exist, like, right now. There's no point at which it began existing. But obviously the car exists, like, it's there, but it does seem to me that, like, it never just popped into existence. All the stuff that made the car was already there. The only thing that has sort of started existing is a particular arrangement. You know what I mean?
Yes.
But the only thing that can recognize an arrangement of matter is some kind of mind. Because, like, you could have a bunch of logs all, like, stacked up against each other, but there's no mind to view them. They're just a bunch of logs stacked up on each other. For someone to say, oh, well, they look like this kind of shape, and it could be used in this particular way, you need a conscious mind. And so, like, the very existence of objects becomes, like, mentally dependent. And I was like, whoa, I don't know about all that. And I went away and thought about it, and I think he's right. So the best way that I can describe it is by saying that, like, okay, there's a microphone in front of me. Does the left-hand side of this microphone exist? Like, yes, It does, because it's right there. You know what I'm referring to,
Mhm.
and it's right there, and it exists in the real
Mhm.
world. But clearly the concept of the left-hand side of the microphone requires my mind. You know what I mean? Like
To
to have the
designate
concept of
it.
left and
Yes.
right and so the thing that my words are referring to is the atoms that make up this part of the microphone. Does that exist? Yes. But to call it the left-hand side of the microphone as opposed to the right-hand side of the microphone is a totally mental thing.
Mental construct.
All of the things that I'm referring to with my mental construct do exist. The atoms exist. But like the distinction between the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the microphone is totally mental. It's not a real distinction in the object. It's just a mental one. And it's very easy to see how the left-hand side versus the right-hand side is a purely mental construction. But this worldview is more radical in saying that the distinction between the microphone and the stand and the chair and the chair and the wallpaper is
Interesting.
all a mental distinction
Mhm.
because it's all just atoms, all just arranged in various ways.
Mhm.
And so it's a super kind of radical way of viewing the world, but I find it quite attractive. I think it makes a lot of sense.
I've seen that pop up in different cultures in the way they refer to their bodies.
Really?
Like, would you have a name for this part of your body
Oh,
here
sure.
between your elbow and your wrist?
Yeah.
What would you call this?
Well, I'd call it my forearm.
But then on the flip side,
I
what would you call this?
don't know.
But like
Yeah.
other cultures would have like a specific name for this body part, this plane versus this plane.
Yeah.
And like to us, that's not an important distinction to make, but that's like a construct that they find valuable. But there's no, you're right, there's no
real difference. It's all just one thing, or like, you know, one sort of arrangement of stuff.
It's funny while you were describing that
Mhm.
worldview, because that just seems, that feels apparent to me.
Mhm.
It's hard for me to imagine what the opposite is, to believe that objects could come into existence.
Well, it's
What is
not.
the,
That's why it's actually not that radical. I think it's a radical way of thinking about it because you realize that essentially objects don't exactly exist.
Mhm.
Like as like a chair doesn't exist in the sense that there's no real thing, distinguishable object called a chair.
Yes.
But the thing that our mind labels a chair does exist, but
Mhm.
the chair itself doesn't exist. It sounds very radical, but like you say, when you talk it through, it's like, well, of course, objects are just rearrangement of pre-existing matter.
Mhm.
And so people will say, well, the thing that begins to exist is form. Like form is a real thing.
Mhm.
You have matter and you have form, and that's where objects come from. But this has actually been a problem for a long time. I mean, think about Plato and his realm of the forms.
Mhm.
Like, where does this come from? Because Plato has this problem of the one and the many. Like, well, that over there is a chair. This here is a chair. But they're like separate objects. What makes them both chairs? Why are they both chairs?
Mhm.
Like, what is it that they share in common? Oh, is it having four legs? I mean, that chair over there, our viewers can't see it. That chair over there doesn't even have legs, really. It's sort of got this weird sculpture thing underneath it. And so it can't be that. And Plato's answer is, well, there must be this form of chair that things participate in. And so when people hear my mereological nihilism and they go, oh, that sounds a bit far-fetched and a bit absurd, I'm like, well, how did Plato solve this problem? By like imagining this realm of like abstract forms that all chairs like participate in. Like this is actually a really difficult problem to solve, I think, unless you kind of bite this bullet and just say, yeah, no, like the only distinctions are mental ones.
Do you think that applies to abstract? Do you think that there are discrete abstract ideas, or that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm less tempted to say so because it does seem like thoughts and concepts can sort of actually arise where they weren't before. But the thing is, it's going to depend on what the matter of a thought is. Right? Like if you are a total materialist, if you're was it an eliminative materialist, then thoughts just sort of collapse into matter. And so yeah, you'd have to apply your mereological nihilism to thoughts. But if thoughts are really these immaterial, special kinds of things, then they might be immune from this problem. Actually, I've thought of a really interesting argument for sort of mind-body dualism, or the immateriality of the mind, that a friend of mine, I think, first brought my attention to. And like I can't remember where he got it from. There's some scholar in the world that I'm not crediting here for this, but take everything I've just said about mereological nihilism, about the fact that there is no real distinction between objects. There's only a mental distinction. So premise 1, there is no real distinction between material things. Premise 2, minds are really distinct from each other. Conclusion, minds are not material. I thought that's an interesting thought, because it just seems as though my mind really is just distinct from yours. It doesn't seem like it's just an arrangement of matter that someone's put a label on. It's like, no, I have a first person center of consciousness. You have one too. We can't like merge them together. We can't like watch them sort of dance around and put a different label on it or something. They seem really distinct. And so if I'm really a mereological nihilist about material objects, but I also really believe that minds are distinct, then I have to think that minds are not material, or that minds are a very, very, very special kind of material, which I suppose everybody does anyway. But I thought that was kind of interesting. So
translation would be a lot easier if minds weren't distinct.
that's probably true. Well, in a way, translation as language itself. Well, language, I think the purpose of language is I have something in my mind, and if only, like I always think, if I could just like open up your brain and prod it in a particular way with like a scalpel to make that thought in my mind arise in your mind, I'd love to do that, because then we'd have the same thought and you'd understand where I'm coming from. That tool kind of exists, and it's called language. I vibrate the air in a particular way that prods your brain in a particular way in an attempt to make that thought arise in your head. And language and translation is just the attempt to take this thought in this head and get it over into this head, you know? And I think it often goes wrong. Such as in the case of Genesis 1:1. You told me that there were like 7 different problems with this, and I think we've covered like 2 or 3 of them. So,
yeah, we covered 2 that are things that English inserts into the text, but there's also a few things that the English omits. Including out of the, 7 words in Genesis 1:1 in Hebrew, 2 of them are not even translated into English.
Really? My next question is going to be, which ones?
What are they?
and what should they mean?
And that's because there's a special kind of word in ancient Hebrew that you use anytime you want to specify a specific object in the world. You preface it with a word that signals that you're about to conjure up a specific object rather than just like
a concept or
yes,
abstract, like the difference between saying
a general thing, like a specific thing.
Yeah, like think about the red telephone box.
Yes.
Versus I'm going to talk about the red telephone box that's out on the street right over there.
And so there's this word that's 2 letters, et, which is made up of aleph, which is the first letter in Hebrew, and a tav, which is the last letter. So it's a little bit like saying A to Z or A to Z every time that you call out a specific object. And you could say that that's just like a grammatical article for clarity, but a lot of like the mystics or the rabbinical scholars would say that more than just like a procedural word, it's actually like an important ceremonial word, and that every time you're stopping to reference a specific object, you take a moment to remember the A to Z's, the A to Z, the universe of things from which you are calling out that object, to know, like you were saying, that an object doesn't exist in isolation. An object exists as part of a universe of things that you are pulling it out from. So then every time you mention an object, you're stopping to remember that chaotic entirety of all the materials in the universe, and that you're just calling out a little bit of it. And you're stopping to do that every time you use a direct object. And that's definitely been lost to time. Like modern Hebrew speakers use the word et probably with as much thought as we just use articles like a, an, in the. But a lot of the mystical thinkers from going back 1,000 years would say, no, this is an important ceremonial word to take a moment to communicate what it is you're doing when you are referencing an object.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And so is this like every time you say something like, there's a chair over there, or go and pick up a banana or something. Like anytime you say like a singular object noun, you would say this word et.
I picked up et banana.
Right.
In English, we would say I picked up banana.
Yeah. That's interesting. Okay, so where is that used in Genesis 1:1?
So it would be in the beginning, God created et the heavens, and then et again the earth. So both of those are objects, heaven and earth. And before those are referenced, there's that little interesting word there. And then I suppose the English translators just decided, oh, English doesn't have this function, so we can just omit those two words because they're not necessary. Everybody knows when you're referencing a direct object in English, it's clear from the syntax. But that's a really interesting thing to do if you're claiming to be translating the inspired word of God. It's really fascinating to already in the first verse decide that there's information that's irrelevant.
Yeah. I wonder if there are many schools of thought which believe in, the Holy Spirit inspiring translators as much as they might inspire the evangelists who wrote the Gospels or whatever. So how should we be trying to incorporate this into English? I mean, I want to ask about this translator that you were telling me about a moment ago, how he approaches this.
I don't think he touches on that and just assumes that it's not possible.
Yeah.
But then it really brings up the question of why, if you believe it's the inspired word of God, would you not try to copy that linguistic feature in the way that you speak yourself? Like if you are claiming that your worldview is derived from the Bible, wouldn't you want to talk about things the way that the Bible, who decided that was irrelevant information?
Yeah. And I can see why it would seem that way, because you're reading it and it would be a bit like translating English and we have the word a or an or the, and you think, well, the message is getting across, it's just like a word, it's just a grammatical thing. But perhaps not. But it's hard to know, right? Because we don't know what the intention was of using that particular word.
Especially if you're talking about, this isn't just a written language, this like Proto-Semitic script. This is like some of the first time that language is ever being written down at all. So it's like there may have been some of these customs that were very meaningful to people using written language for the first time that have slowly lost relevant or like slowly stopped being important after thousands of years of writing so many text after text.
That's what happens with language when you pick a word which is supposed to have a lot of significance and meaning, but the more it gets used, especially if it's used as commonly as sort of before any object, it just starts to lose its meaning. It's why even the phrase like "I have no words" has become it's sort of lost its import. I mean, there would have been a time when the first person to sort of to try to be picking a really poetic language, a word to describe their grief or something, says, "I have no words. Words cannot contain the feeling that I have." And the first person to hear that would have gone, "Whoa, that's really powerful. What a powerful thing to say," right? But now if someone says, "Words cannot express it," it's sort of
throwaway.
Exactly, right? And that happens all the time. It is very difficult actually to pick.
I definitely think that would be the function of like good poetry, is like to make that feel fresh every single time.
It's exactly what I was just thinking, is that poetry. I also think this is the same thing. I've always thought about this when it comes to things like public speaking. People know I've always admired people like Christopher Hitchens, who could throw together these beautiful poetic phrases. And sure, there's a lot of like big words, right? But then you get this particular kind of public speaker that just throws in a lot of big words, and it's kind of impressive, but it doesn't quite have the same poetic eloquence. I think maybe someone like Russell Brand is a good example of this, right? Like, just he's obviously sort of swallowed a thesaurus, and he's very good at picking these words and stuff, but it never felt poetic. And I realized that, like, it seems like poetry isn't about, or poetic speaking isn't about picking an eloquent word, but using ordinary words in an eloquent way. Right? And that's a very difficult thing to do. And I think that's something that we have to do when our words just sort of lose their emotional import, because they just sort of don't have it anymore. I mean, when someone tells you they're devastated, you think like, oh, okay, But I heard a footballer say that he was devastated to lose the game. But I also heard,
Devastated.
they say, "Oh, I'm just devastated to lose the tournament," and they say it on TV. It's like, okay,
So what would he do if an asteroid hit his town and wiped it off? What word would he have left?
honestly, he would probably just say he was devastated, right? And that's the problem, is that like you sort of you've blown up all degrees of meaning in our words, but it's inevitably going to happen. And so, I mean, thinking about that, like the word devastated, like devastation. Think about what devastation is, like utter devastation. It's a very powerful concept.
Hmm.
But when someone says, "Oh, I was devastated to miss that," to miss that show that I was supposed to go to or something.
What does "vastating" mean? Is it devastating?
I don't know.
That'd be a
I
good
don't
one
know.
for the etymology nerd or somebody.
Yeah,
to
there are
break that
some.
one down.
I know that there are some really interesting examples of words that sound like they should be like the opposite of something, but are not. Like, I think there's a really good example of this. I think it's the word nonchalant, because it's like nonchalant is a word, is a term that we use in English, but no one says chalant, which is really strange. Actually, though, I think people sort of say chalant almost as a joke, as to mean the opposite of nonchalant, and I'm sure it'll be no time before it sort of actually becomes part of the lexicon. But I think there are also probably examples of things which sound like they should be they should, like, where you have like a word like descriptive or something, where it sounds like it should be scriptive and then descriptive, but it might actually be that the word descript became something else. Like it's a bit misleading in that way.
We do use the word individual, but not individual.
There you go. That's
which is an
that's a much
interesting
better
one,
example. Yeah.
which I think we use the word, oh, he's an individual. It almost just becomes a synonym for like person. But it's really weird that the word individual has a philosophy baked into it. You're saying this is an entity that cannot be divided anymore. Whether or not you actually believe that, but then language kind of glazes over time and hardens into this thing where you're just throwing around the term individual just to mean a guy or a person.
See, I didn't know that. I didn't know that was the origin of the word individual. I've never thought about it. It's amazing how much you don't think about it until someone points it out. But
it's like such a like words just become such commodities where it's just like, oh, I need to refer to a person, I'll use this term individual.
So that's what that means. Individual is
individual.
Like, in like divisible, in that you can't divide.
An entity that you can't divide into any more parts.
That's brilliant. And so it does start as meaning like not individual, but we just don't now have the word for individual. I might start using that word to try and popularize individuals for people who are more sort of scattered and all over the place. It's like you're being a bit individualistic.
I think you could get that to catch on.
Why not? Let's try it. People should start using it in comment sections across YouTube and see if it catches on.
Can I just say?
Yes, sir.
Nonchalant is a French word.
Yes.
Chalant is a French word.
French word. I see. I thought that might be the case.
Yeah, so we do. It's really rare.
So
we
you
use chalant. And chalant doesn't mean much. It's not the opposite of nonchalant, but a chalant person is like.
What does chalant mean?
It's to describe a regular customer into a store. That's a chalant person.
Just like so it does mean sort of the.
It's an adjective.
It just means like normal.
Yeah, it's like
average.
a regular customer.
And you would commonly use that in French.
No, very rare.
Oh, but it is a word.
It is a word. It does exist, but it is very rare.
Do French people say nonchalant?
We do say nonchalant, yeah.
But you don't say chalant a lot, but it is a word.
Yes.
So that's why. So it's popular to say nonchalant. So that's why it's come to English.
And it's got completely different meanings.
But it's less popular to say chalant. So English speakers haven't picked that
migrated.
up. Well, what do you? Because would you say that nonchalant is an English word? I mean, it's French, right? But it's so commonly used in English that it's probably in like an English dictionary, right? Like nonchalant, and we don't say like nonchalant, we say nonchalant. You know, so like, sorry, was that might have been an offensive impression.
No, it's fine. It's like bravo. Bravo is a French word. You say bravo.
Yeah, exactly, bravo, and okay, so. I did suspect that chalant would be a word, at least in French, but I didn't want to embarrass myself by saying it. I'm glad that we have. Man, it's great to have a team of people behind the camera to fact check us, right? Did you know that the word ingenious and genius have completely independent word origins?
Are you serious?
Completely independent etymologies.
Different source languages as
Different-
well?
I'm not sure. I'm gonna look it up. Let's find out, because I know that it sort of sounds like you have genius, and then you have ingenious, which sounds like it should be the opposite, but they mean the same thing. They both mean clever. You know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
They're not actually the opposite of each other.
Uh-huh.
So they're even spelt differently, which gives you an indication that they're not actually from the same root. So genius is spelt like with an I-U-S, and ingenious is spelt with an O-U-S at the end. According to Google, the etymology of genius comes from the Latin, I don't know how to pronounce Latin. It's like gingere or gingere, which means to beget. Ingenious comes from the Latin ingenium, intellect. So you've got ingenious coming from the word for intellect, and genius coming from the word to beget. So probably to be able to like produce, to be able to sort of put things out into the world or something like that. But they're completely independent words that have both evolved to sound very similar in English and actually mean the same thing, but they sound like opposites. Genius, ingenious, but they mean the same thing. So you can sort of put it as a riddle to people. You know, why is it that genius and ingenious mean the same thing? And I bet they'll give you 5 to 10 different suggestions before they guess that it's just a pure coincidence that they've got completely independent etymologies and they just happen to marry up on the same meaning. I've always found that to be one of my favorite etymology facts.
If we had to do away with one of those, which version are you keeping?
Well, having just looked up the etymology, so I couldn't remember what the etymology actually was. I think the word ingenious from ingenium or whatever it was for intellect better captures, I think, the way that people sort of use the term today, rather than the ability to produce, or maybe like genius should be a word for like artistic genius.
Yes.
And ingenious should be a word for Einstein. And maybe that's kind of how, although Einstein did, you know, beget thought experiments and stuff, but maybe that's kind of how it's supposed to be used. Maybe you're not really supposed to call, you know, like, you shouldn't say, oh, that's an ingenious piece of art. But then people kind of don't say that, do they?
Yeah, I wonder if there's like, if you consult the encyclopedia or the Oxford Dictionary, if it's like, you must use ingenious to refer to this type of thing, ingenious for people only.
I wonder.
But then in regular conversation, nobody pays attention to those sort of rules, so it all becomes quite a mess over time.
Ingenious is defined, again, by Google as of a person, clever, original, and inventive, which actually sounds a lot more like the beget situation. Whereas genius, the definition according to Google is exceptional intellectual or creative power, other natural ability. So weirdly, it's like the definitions have sort of swapped.
Yes.
It should be the other way around. I don't know. But the thing about etymology that's so interesting is it doesn't really matter, because a word is just, the definition of a word is descriptive, not prescriptive.
Yes.
Right? It doesn't tell you how a word should be used. It tells you how a word is used. I've always found it really interesting that a dictionary is entirely self-referential. Like every word in the dictionary is defined with regards to another word in the dictionary. So you could like give someone who doesn't speak the language a dictionary, and with all the time in the world, they probably couldn't work out any of the words, even if they had the whole dictionary with them, because it's all completely self-referential. It's really, really interesting to think how that sort of got off the ground. That was what, 3 or 4 of the problems that we've covered in Genesis 1:1 so far?
I think we've covered 3 so far.
What else have we got?
And the last one was about 2 words that were omitted from the first verse. And I think there's actually another interesting layer of information that's just omitted in the English version. And that is due to the fact that Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, is a gendered language, so that every single noun that is used has a gender that's either male or masculine or feminine, and there's no possibility for a neutral gender, much like French or Spanish or something like that. So in that first verse, you would say, in the beginning, God, which would be a masculine noun, created the heavens, another masculine noun, and the earth, which is a feminine noun.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a question about how much original readers are like paying attention to that, the meaning of a gender of a word that's used, because like French speakers, I don't know, aren't stopping to think about, oh, I used the word for bridge, and that must be, what is the French word for bridge?
What's the French word for bridge?
Un pont. It's
pont.
masculine.
It's masculine.
Masculine. But do you think of a bridge as masculine? Like, does that affect the way you see the object?
No, no.
Because I didn't think so, right? But I didn't know. I assumed not. So no.
There is one study that I think, I wish I knew who the researcher was, but they did see if there was any bias of whether like French speakers perceive bridges to have more masculine qualities inherently,
Right.
like that they might be more sturdy.
Strong and yeah. all
And
that
I
kind of
believe
stuff.
they did find like some detectable difference for some
Yeah.
words.
Did you hear? I don't know how much of this is true. It might just be like a Twitter thing, but people said that when they've named hurricanes after men rather than women, because you get like Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, that when they name them after men, people take more precautions because they take them more seriously because they perceive them as more like violent and destructive. It's
And after coming out of Helene,
Mm.
I definitely that is definitely very interesting to me right now. That
Yeah.
People would be like, "Oh, we don't need to
Yeah.
do as much for this
but
one."
it's surely it wouldn't be something that they would even consciously do, right? It's not like if you asked people,
Mm-mm.
you know, are you gonna? Well, they're calling it Helene, so do you really think we should evacuate now? So no one's actually thinking like that, but I think.
Subconsciously.
And again, I should clarify. I don't actually know if this. It might be one of those truisms that gets thrown around, but I've heard at least that that's the case. People at least make jokes about it. They say like, why? Like I saw people saying like, I am not dying to a hurricane called Milton. Call it like Hurricane Death Destroyer 50,000 or something, because then it's going to scare me. But I'm not running away from Milton. And I think like there might be some truth
formidable.
in that, there might be some truth in that, and it's and there's probably something similar going on in gendered languages, right? There, I mean, there has to be some psychological effect.
I think there definitely could be a subconscious effect, but also I think the gender of the Bible in its original language is also used for literary purposes. Like on each of the days of creation, it's interesting that third day of creation, when God creates the land and then the plants and the vegetation that come out of it, you see the sudden sprinkling of feminine words coming from the earth, which is another feminine word. So it's kind of seen as one of the most feminine days of creation, the third day. And it's also interesting that Tuesday is also a popular day for Orthodox Jewish weddings. I think one, because of that emphasis on femininity, and also it's the only day that God like says is good twice. So it's like a doubly blessed day. And I think original reader probably would have registered that the verse feels more feminine than other things that God were creating.
Sure.
And so there's an interesting thing happening there of masculine weeds and masculine trees coming out of the feminine earth that you definitely could mine for some materials, because definitely later, like on the sixth day of creation, when God forms a woman from a masculine man, Adam, people derive loads of meaning from that, but then paying attention to the gendered information of masculine grass coming from feminine earth is just seen as like not important. But what if that was communicating something essential about the structure of reality, the same way that people derive meaning from Eve coming from Adam? But for some reason, a lot of like fundamentalist people, I think Christians, would say that they have like a biblical view of gender and that their view of gender is derived from Genesis, which seems to be a bold claim if you've decided that the vast majority of gendered material and information is irrelevant.
Doesn't matter. Yeah. It's difficult to know how that would be captured in the English language, though, is the thing. I mean, there's so much that you lose. And there are ways that you could maybe try to do it, but it would be a bit weird. I mean, for example, I know that I've been told that if you read ancient Hebrew, when you read these ancient texts, it's very clear that you're dealing with an amalgamation of authors over lots of time, because the language sort of changes.
Mhm.
It would be as if we were speaking like this, and then suddenly I started speaking Shakespearean English or Middle English.
Go for it.
I nearly tried to do it as an example, but I don't think I could quite pull that off.
Prithee.
You know, like you'd notice, right? And
Yes.
if you were reading it in a text, you'd realize, oh, well, this must have been written hundreds of years before this,
Mhm.
and that must have been just because of the style of the text.
Mhm.
When you translate it into English, all of that disappears.
Mhm.
It's just gone. You just read the whole thing in the same cadence, the same tone. And there would be ways around that. I mean, we could decide that the older Hebrew text should be translated into English a bit more King Jamesy, a bit more thee and a bit more thou. But then the newer texts, the more recently written texts, we should translate into modern English just to sort of carry the point. But it would just be a very weird way of doing it, and it would seem like a very sort of experimental kind of translation, because you're translating the very sort of, you wouldn't be translating the actual oldness of the text, because that
Mhm.
language is so much older than
Mhm.
Middle English, but you'd at least be translating the relative difference between this book and this book, or this part of the book and this part of the book. I mean, I'm told that like mid flow, it just switches style a lot of the time. And I don't know this, I can't confirm this because I don't speak Hebrew, but
I think a lot of translators would say the attempt to replicate that would be distracting or too much.
Yeah.
But also, if it truly is a literary feature of the original text, it seems pretty important to try to capture that. And what if the original person assembling the text meant for it to be disorientating?
Exactly.
What if they meant for it to be a bit of a whiplash?
Maybe
But the English Bible is translated in a way that kind of assumes that it's all supposed to be a seamless, non-interrupted, uniform document, the way that like a legal document needs to sound like a decree came from one person and that had their act together. And that's a huge assumption, I think.
I would be so interested to read a translation of the Bible that made this attempt to capture how antiquated the language is, to give you a feeling of how old the verse is that you're reading based on the kind of language that's being used. I'm not sure if anyone's ever attempted such a thing. I hope they have. If they have, then hopefully they can let me know. But yeah, you do lose a lot in. I mean, that's why they say lost in translation. But it's not just because a word is wrong, or because it's supposed to be that. I mean, you had this reel about calling a spade,
Yes.
which I found really interesting. Or this short about how well you tell us, like it sounds very weird, right? We have that phrase in English. You call a spade, but like a spade, like why not a chair or a cat or something more common? Where does that come from?
It was interesting that was a surprisingly controversial video,
Really?
because apparently a lot of people have never heard the phrase call a spade a spade.
Oh, really?
Would you use that?
Yeah, I use that.
Like you would use it
to
say that someone's like speaking frankly about something?
Yeah,
like,
I mean, it's like, hey, that guy, I like that guy. He calls a spade a spade. He says it as it is. Yeah.
And then like the prop that I was holding in that video to explain the origin of that phrase, I think it had a flat top.
Oh,
and
don't
it's
tell me
skinny.
it wasn't a spade.
And in like where I'm in my area, that is a spade and a rounded one is a shovel.
Okay.
But then so many people were saying like, that's not a spade. Why are you doing that? That's so confusing. I'm like, oh, there's no consensus about which of these shapes is a spade.
Which by the way, is like the exact problem with online discourse is that you said, hey, I've got this interesting fact about where the phrase calling a spade comes from, and you're holding a shovel potentially by mistake, and everyone's like, hey man, that's not a spade, that's a shovel. As if that, I mean, you could have been holding up, you literally could have been holding up a book and saying it's a spade, and it like, who cares, man? Just like, get on with it, I don't know. But so spade a spade, let's grant that it's a phrase that we use, and if anybody watching doesn't agree with them, then they'll have it on my authority at least. So in this short, you say that different cultures have different words, like calling a cat or calling a book or whatever.
Mhm.
And in English, it has something to do with some Latin translation,
Oh, yes.
because in some like ancient play, like an ancient Greek play,
Yes.
the origin of this phrase is like something like call a urinal a urinal.
Yes.
And
It's like saying you have the audacity to call this unpleasant bathroom device what it is.
So,
And
so
then-
you can imagine when somebody says, you know, they call a spade, they're saying something like, look, they're calling a urinal a urinal. You know, that there's something that they're just willing to go there, right?
Yeah,
But then it gets, well, translated. And what happens?
and I guess someone thought that they weren't comfortable with that word and said we should change it to something a little more suitable for public discourse and
Yeah.
change it to calling a shovel
Yeah,
a
'cause
shovel, maybe a shovel that you would dig the
dig the hole. Yeah,
dig
the,
the
the
hole
word
for.
itself is like, it's not literally the word for
like
urinal.
a trough. It's like a trough that you
Yeah.
like.
that you would do your business in.
Yes.
And so some Latin translation says, well, I'm not going to say let's call a trough. I'm going to change it for the thing that the
Yes.
trough is dug with, which is the spade. And so we end up with this very strange sort of,
Euphemism for a figure of speech about frankness.
yeah, exactly. That's the great irony. Is the whole point is that you're supposed to call the urinal a urinal, but this guy refused to, and now we have this strange phrase which doesn't even carry the meaning anymore.
I was really hoping people would be interested in that line of thought, but it was mostly comments about
Yeah,
my inability to identify
to identify
what.
to call a spade.
Yes.
and instead call it a shovel. Okay, what else have we got?
We talked about gendered languages.
Yes, sir.
This is another interesting thing that's inserted into the text. And that's when Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That word God is interesting in that it has a big capital G, which is an interesting thing to do, to impose onto a language like ancient Hebrew that has no distinction of any capital letters. The first letters in a sentence are written in the same case that the last letter of the sentence is written in, and whether you're referencing a verb or any type of word, it's not going to be capitalized in Hebrew. But English, being derived from some older Germanic language that had some worldview that nouns have some kind of priority in the universe, and that anytime you reference a noun, it should be capitalized a head and shoulders above the other text, which is interesting. I guess English decided, okay, we're not going to do that for all nouns. Although it's interesting. Have you ever read picked up something from late 18th century,
Right.
and it's like every noun is still capitalized in
Yeah.
English?
Or maybe some. I think if you read like the Declaration of Independence, words
there's-
like liberty and
Yes.
democracy, they're all sort of capitalized.
So English, I guess, decided we're not going to do the German thing of doing this to all nouns. But it is interesting that in that first verse of the Bible, you see a remnant of a very different philosophy that believes that nouns are more important than other figures of speech, which is, I don't think, an insubstantial difference. I think is a substantial difference.
Yeah, there are attempts throughout Scripture to put respect on the name of God through using sort of grammatical techniques. So capitalizing the word Lord in its entirety, you know, or God, or putting Jesus's words in red, or things like this, which are clearly sort of not parts of the original language. But I mean, do you think it could sort of cause a problem of understanding for the text, this capitalization thing?
I think it's such a part of the worldview that you're approaching the text to as someone who is immersed and came out of an English speaking environment, that you may just have a priority that objects and nouns are more important than actions. And that's interesting because in ancient Hebrew, the priority is on verbs, and the verb comes before the subject as a norm. So there's really this philosophy you're projecting onto the text that objects have some sort of priority over actions,
Again,
which is not the biblical worldview, I would think.
yeah, it's the importation of philosophical outlooks or biases or frameworks without
Yes.
necessarily realizing it. I just remembered I meant to ask on the gendered language stuff. You were talking about Adam and Eve.
Yes.
Was Eve formed from Adam's rib?
Sure. There's definitely a lot of controversy about that. There seems to be several ways in which that's later in Genesis. Several ways in which the English translation seems to undermine Eve or to make her part seem less substantial than Adam's. The big example would be the English describes Eve as being Adam's helper, which is, that seems like a bit of an insult.
It's subservient, yeah.
Yes.
You're a helper.
Depending on what culture you come from. But other languages have like tiers of words for help, where it's like, oh, if you just need help with bringing in the groceries, that's help. Like in Spanish, that would be like ayuda, like just regular help. But then there's like, oh, you pulled somebody out, or you like rescued somebody from like a raging river. Did you help them? Oh yeah, but that's like an understatement of the century. It's like you rescued them. And I think the Hebrew word for what Eve is not quite as extreme as like she's his official rescuer, but it definitely has much more of that connotation than just being like a subservient.
Oh, I'll pick up your,
Yes.
laundry for you or whatever.
But that mistranslation of Eve being Adam's helper is definitely used by a variety of groups to say that like women exist to help men with their projects.
Yeah, as opposed to rescuing them from whatever it is that men
what it
do.
needs to be rescued from. And so that's one way that, whether that was an intentional choice to minimize the role of women, or whether it was just something that seemed natural to the translator because that didn't offend their worldview.
Yeah. Well, but it could be so subconscious. You could be reading it and you don't even think to yourself, oh, well, it's important to work out here, is God intending to put woman as subservient to man here? That thought doesn't cross your mind because, well, women are subservient to men.
Yeah,
that's your worldview.
She's,
so you're like,
she's his helper. And
so yeah, she's his helper. That of course that makes sense. And you don't even stop to think about it. Again, the importation of a worldview into a text. I mean, it's easy for us now to say that, well, that's a bias. That's like a sexist bias that could have crept into the Old Testament. And we have to realize that people just wouldn't have even seen it as a bias. It's just the way it is. It's not an idea. It's not my worldview that women have this role and men have this role. That's just true. That's just how it is. And so when I'm talking here about, and it keeps coming up, this importation of philosophy into translation, it's not like some conscious decision, like you're saying, somebody's intentionally trying to lower the position of women in society. It could be the case.
You could see that somebody was like malevolent and was like,
it could be
hate women, and I'm in charge of this translation project. So now's my chance to insert my worldview
into like
to adjust
holy scripture. I mean, so it could
probably
be
not
intentionally,
that,
but it seems so much more likely to me that
absent-minded kind of just this is the way we saw the world, and so it comes out into these nuances in interpretation that now that we have perspective on, we take issue with.
Yeah. And what about the rib?
I think the rib is another example of a translation issue that maybe subconsciously or consciously was used to minimize the role of Eve, because from what I've read, the scholars don't believe that ancient Hebrew has a word for a specific rib bone. Like no one's ever talking about, oh, I broke this bone right here, which is interesting. Like in a pre-surgical society where people have different ideas about how their body works, you're not going to have a name for like your appendix or your larynx, because you're not thinking of dividing the body up into those terms. So much later, by the time Aramaic was popular, Aramaic did have a word for a specific rib bone that's actually like used in the Bible. I think it's talking about like a lion chewing on, like much like you would. Do they eat ribs in London?
I think somewhere, yeah, they
Like
must.
you're like gnawing them off the bone.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely much more an American thing, but I'm sure.
It's pretty grotesque.
Yeah, I'm getting nods. Yeah, yeah.
Yes, I'll leave that alone. But there is a word for a specific rib bone that developed much later, but scholars would say that there's no word for an individual rib bone. So in Genesis, we read that Eve was formed from Adam's word, Sela, Tsela, and that is usually translated as like a side or a part, maybe even a half of something. Like if you have a boat, you might call this a Sela and this a Sela, like a side. And all the other times that the word appears throughout the Bible, it's a more equitable distribution of like, this is just like a part of something, or like, oh, you took a side of a baguette or something like that.
Yeah.
But then for some reason, it's very interesting that when it's talking about Eve coming from Adam's Sela, it's made as diminutive as possible, where it's not a half or a portion or a chunk or a part. It's just one tiny little rib. And that's not to say like that a rib's not important, because like a rib performs an important function. It protects you and does something, but it does start to have hints of misogyny if someone is choosing to translate that as an individual rib bone to avoid a more straightforward translation that she came from a whole side of Adam.
Yeah.
And so, and if you look at like if you look at older texts for Jewish rabbinical writings on this passage, they'll bring up the idea that the original Adam was created with 2 heads, 4 arms, and 4 legs conjoined at the back, almost like a big spider, and then was split down the middle into 2 parts. And that would seem to imply a bit more of equality between these 2 creatures that is definitely absent from the idea of Eve being formed from just a little disposable bit of Adam's flesh. And I think if you were trying to make the case that women don't have a place in society, there's definitely one of those translations that you would prefer. It would be much more useful to your agenda than the other.
Indeed. And again, even if that's kind of subconscious, that would still be the case. Okay, quick detour back to the gendered language thing, so I wanted to ask you about that. But we were talking about this capitalization thing.
Yes.
And where were we with that?
Because in that first verse of the Bible, there's 2 capital words, the first word of the Bible, in, and the name of God being capitalized as a proper noun. And that's really a carryover from like an earlier Germanic language. And I think that's really interesting then, that when you're reading Genesis 1:1 in English, you're reading a version that is filtered through first a Greek culture with its philosophy and its worldview, and then a Germanic one. So there's like a level of philosophies that have been stacked.
Philosophical palimpsest.
Yes. And a lot of those in those worldviews may be incompatible with those languages, may have certain things embedded in them that are incompatible with the worldview or contradictory to the worldview of the original author, especially when you think of like English developing as a mercantile language in like maybe the Habsburg dynasty or something like that. You have this language that was developed for the purpose of easing financial transactions and making commerce faster. And it seems like a language that's built on those priorities might have some conflict with the Bible, that is one skeptical of money, skeptical of the agenda of money, and also like spoken by like wandering nomadic tribes that aren't as invested in trade and goods. But English as a language is like obsessed with goods, and you would see that in like capitalizing nouns. There's like this obsession with.
Interesting.
You see that connection?
Yeah, absolutely. You don't think about how much languages evolved for function.
Yes.
And we forget how much what the function is going to affect how the language evolves. It's like the Arabic language is just like so embedded with religious language in a way that it sort of isn't, or maybe once was here. I mean, terms like God willing and stuff like that, and the word goodbye,
God be with
which
you,
of course comes from God be with ye, God be with you, you know, and but it's I guess it's less obvious, but that's quite the point, isn't it? It's like if you look at the Arabic language, it's very clear that, you know, the word Allah is in so many phrases and you know exactly why it's there and what it's doing. Whereas we forget that words like goodbye would have once just meant something like a divine blessing upon a person, and now have completely changed their meaning. So if you're reading a text that's been translated through the word goodbye, it might be that like there's some ancient text where someone was trying to put a divine blessing on someone, and someone at a particular time in the development of the English language translated that into an abbreviated version of God be with you. And somebody in modern English or French or something read that and said, oh, they're saying goodbye, so transformed it into au revoir. And now you've gone from somebody saying, you know, I hope that God blesses you on your onward journey, to, hey, till I see you again, you know, to see you later. Yeah, that's what translation does, I suppose, inevitably. And that's why I'm kind of glad that for all the problems we have of biblical translations, because it's such an important text, there have been so many investigations and translations and retranslations, and like it's difficult to. The cultural impact is still there because people just read the NIV to their children, and that's that.
Yes.
But if you want it, if you want to find out, the information is there for you, and you can always go and learn Hebrew yourself as well. But it seems like this sort of endless fountain of problems and paradoxes. It's where I must say I was surprised when you said that we could potentially do an entire episode just on Genesis 1:1. Join us next week for Genesis 1:2. But yeah, seriously, I mean it's interesting. So
I hadn't really thought about the Arabic language being like just inundated with spirituality and religion. I think it kind of goes unnoticed to us how much of the English language is saturated with financial terms, even in the Bible itself. If we think about how we talk about God, so much of it is through transactional financial terms. Like we talk about like God will call you into account someday, or Jesus paid the price. Trying to think of something, or even being saved. Maybe that's also a financial savings. It's kind of like a financial term.
I know what you mean. Like you know, and the word account there, you'll be called to account. That kind. It's an analogy. It's a financial analogy that becomes what George Orwell would have called a dead metaphor, where it's sort of no longer a metaphor anymore. It just becomes a phrase in its own right.
But I do think it indicates the reasons for which the English language developed as a way of easing commerce that is not necessarily important to a nomadic tribe. And I think English didn't really recognize the extent to which that mercantile urge just was a part of the language until English missionaries went to like the Americas and encountered indigenous tribes that didn't use money. And then they figured out if you have no concept of money, they were like, how can we communicate the gospel to them? Because there's like, it requires some sort of like accounting metaphor to believe that like I have done something wrong. So I'm in debt to God, who has to buy me back by paying the price. And if you have no concept of money, you have no idea what a debt is. There's no idea that someone's keeping a ledger that says like, oh, I lent you some money that now you must give back to me. So then it turns out they really had a hard time trying to figure out how to communicate anything about Christianity at all without referring to money.
Well, it's only, like you say, coming into contact with a culture that doesn't do that you
Yes.
even realize you're doing it. It's like the air you breathe. The language
Yes.
that you speak is the medium through which you speak. And so you don't even notice it's the case.
Mhm.
I'm sure that Goethe once said of language, he who knows one knows none.
Uh-huh.
And I'm beginning to realize just how true that is.
Mhm.
And it makes me wish that I was bilingual or more bilingual. I sort of have the odd phrase or word that's useful for my job that I can sort of pull out and use. But it does make me realize that I don't really understand the English language at all. Because when I've tried to learn other languages, I've always been fascinated working out why this means that. Because it sort of means something in English that's a bit like this or a bit like that, and yeah, or like how a greeting might mean something more like "peace be with you." And it's like, oh, it's interesting because in English, I can see why those words really mean something like "peace," and it's interesting how people in that culture might not even like cognize that that's what they're doing. That might sound to them just like "hello," and they've sort of forgotten what the meaning is, or maybe they do actually always think about. It's fascinating, and I wish I knew more languages to know.
You are right that it's only in the encountering of a language that is completely different that language can be self-aware of.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that Arabic speakers are cognizant of salam, peace, when they're greeting people. That is a peace greeting. But there must be languages that sort of have similar kinds of translations for hello that maybe aren't as obvious. I think that the word hello, is it true? Again, I'm not sure how true this is, but I hear the word hello was kind of popularized for the telephone.
Yes.
Like it's there sort of wasn't really a word. No one knew what to say, because you'd greet someone and say good day, or you'd just say whatever you had to say to them. But on the phone, you don't know where they are, you don't know what they're up to, and so you didn't know what to say.
To fill.
Yeah, and so this word hello sort of crops up, but it could have been. I think that even like Alexander Graham Bell wanted it to be something else.
Ahoy.
Like ahoy. Yeah, he wanted it to be ahoy, and we could have been
like ships.
because it's now gone from just being a phone term to a normal term. We could have been walking around like ahoy,
ahoy mate.
and it's a bit of a shame. I think that like halloo was another option.
Candidate.
All these different suggestions, and here we are with what kind of sounds like the most boring one, but that's probably just because we're so used to it. We've covered, I think, 5 of the points so far in Genesis 1:1 that are problematic translation-wise. What's number 6?
I could lump 6 and 7 together because it's about the tail end of the verse, which is the phrase of God creating the heavens and the earth. And I think we've talked about things that English adds to the text and takes away from the text, omits. I think a third category of ideas when talking about translation are just matters of vocab and how vocab shifts over time, so that something that meant something to someone at a particular time, if that word's not updated 1,000 years later, that word may be used as a referent to a completely different idea.
Yeah.
And so you've probably heard the idea of the phrase, the heavens and the earth doesn't mean like God created the one thing and then the other thing, but rather it's a figure of speech of, I think it's called a merism, where you use 2 opposite terms to communicate the entirety of something. So like you say, we searched for this thing high and low, and that isn't communicating too specific.
I actually haven't heard that idea as applied to Genesis.
Interesting. So then there's the idea that it's just a way of saying when God started to create everything.
Yeah.
Which kind of goes in line with the speed of what this passage is supposed to have, that it's not telling you a sequence of 2 things that God ordered. It's just saying when God started to create everything. And so I think a modern reader would read that passage and not be familiar with that would be a common phrase people use at the time, and think that it means that God went, okay, I'm creating the heavens and now I'm creating the earth. That's not necessarily what it's saying. It's just saying, possibly just saying God created everything.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that idea. That's interesting. I want to know what like the word earth means there in the Hebrew. I kind of want to look that up, because I wonder if it can mean something like earth as in foundation in the way that
Mhm.
we, because that would make me more convinced of this idea that we're talking about something like high and low and everything in between.
Mhm.
But okay, so we'd end up with like when God created everything,
Yes.
then we have this thing about formless and void, and so it would be like when God created everything, there was formlessness, and then God said, "Let there be light," and it's
Mhm.
sort of light is the landing point of the
Yes.
whole thing.
Yes.
And I'm beginning to see how this is a bit more kind of big bangy, it's sort of like
It de-
light.
it's definitely disorienting
Hmm.
to read something written by someone in 1100 AD, like Ramban or some other rabbinical
Mm-hmm.
thinker writing about the creation of the universe in a way that's more similar to the way that like a modern scientist would describe the event. It's
Yeah.
it's a very uncanny feeling.
Yeah. So how would you, given everything that we've just said, I started by saying, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and then we had a full stop. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. Given everything we've just said, our listeners will hopefully have found it incredibly interesting. And how now do you think they should go about saying Genesis 1:1? I mean, what's your favored sort of understanding, given everything that we've thought about today? How would you prefer to word it?
I definitely think it makes sense to get through that first bit as quick as possible.
Yeah.
Um,
It's worth pointing out as well that all the stuff we said here, these are sort of ideas. Like maybe there shouldn't be a gap here. Maybe the punctuation indicates that makes it feel longer than it is. These are all just suggestions. I mean, maybe the English translation that I started with is the great, perfect, carrier of the original meaning. Yeah, you take and leave these ideas as you see fit, as to what you find interesting. And I suppose I'm wondering which ones you think are just interesting, but probably not right,
mhm.
and how you'd actually put it together.
I do like some of those literary effects from Robert Alter. He has a copy of the Hebrew Bible that took him like 30 years to do, and he's got a really great commentary on it. So it's like when he can't replicate a literary effect that he knows that's in there, he'll go into it in length in the commentary. And that was one of my best purchases, to feel like I'm reading this text through someone who's sensitive to these features and then knows enough to know what cannot possibly be translated into English. And so that's been a great resource. But I think every translation, every way you try to render this verse is going to leave something out. It's going to be misunderstood by modern culture, because how could it not? It's such a different audience coming from a wildly different world, that I think more than trying to find a perfect rendering of Genesis 1:1, I think the approach, making sure you're approaching each Bible verse you read um, with an understanding that there's probably a lot of layers to it that have been completely lost or distorted, and that you're getting like the tip of the iceberg that's been filtered through 1, 2, or 3 cultures. I think it's probably more important to go into a Bible first with that awareness than trying to find the definitive rendering of a passage.
Yeah, well, I think we can treat various translations and interpretations of like an Old Testament passage in the same kind of way that we can interpret differing New Testament accounts of like the person of Jesus, for example. It's like you want to figure out who Jesus is. Well, maybe part of the reason why it's useful to have 4 Gospels, and if this is really a divinely inspired text, maybe the reason that God would choose to do it that way is because what you're really trying to get at is who this person is. And if you read one person's account, then another person's account, then another person's account,
Yes.
and you just what's the sort of common thread that you pull out of them? What sort of vibe do you get of who this Jesus guy was? That gives you a better idea of what really matters. We can swap Jesus for the Hebrew and all the different Gospels for all the different translations, and a similar effect can take place. You read this translation, that translation, that translation, that translation, and what is it that they all sort of point to? What have they got in common? And that maybe gives you a better understanding of the verse. But
You may not be able to directly encounter it, but through
Yeah.
that conglomeration of different translations, you might get a sense
You
of like,
approximate it.
yes.
And without committing yourself to saying that one of those translations, that's my favorite, or that's the one that works best, or whatever. I think. Well, Christopher, I think that's a good place to wrap up. It's been, I often say at the end of podcasts, it's been wide-ranging, but surprisingly wide-ranging given the sort of short, small focus of the subject matter.
I like that biblical studies is really a window into anthropology and sociology and grammar, because it's one of the only like continuous records. The Bible itself is like the only maybe continuous record of the last 2,000-3,000 years of civilization and all that. So I really like that biblical studies doesn't have to be this insulated discussion about the text, but it's really kind of a window out into the world as a whole.
It's not just theology, you're not just doing theology. That's why I like biblical studies so much. I think over the past few years, people have probably noticed, my viewers, I mean listeners, that I've become more interested in biblical studies, which is it might seem strange. I mean, I get like an atheist being interested in theology being a bit weird, but biblical studies, like you say, it can be a very secular pursuit and a very historical pursuit. And I think it's fascinating for that reason. You have 2 long form videos on your channel
that made a year ago,
that are about the Bible, right?
Yes.
Or at least one of them's about the Hebrew language and one of them's about the 10 Commandments.
Yes.
Also really fascinating. I recommend people check that out. But the channel as a whole, Magnify, which will be tagged and linked down in the description, is mostly made up of YouTube shorts. So for those who are listening with short attention spans that want these incredible little golden nuggets of information, it's a wonderful place to go and find it. So I'll make sure that's all linked down below. But like I say, I'm sure that most people will already recognize who you are because your shorts do fantastically well, and with good reason, I think. So thanks for expanding a bit today. I don't know if you often get the opportunity to sit down and talk in more long form content about these kinds of topics.
This would take 120 short videos to have covered the same ground. So.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm glad we got the opportunity to do so, and thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
To get early access to videos, ad-free, and support the channel, subscribe to my Substack at alexoconnor.com.